Welcome, everyone. Maddie's insights are practical tips based on current research to help pets and people and that you can use in your shelter. I'm Kelly Dewar, Senior Shelter Solutions Specialist at Maddie's Fund. Today, we're joined by Sloane Hawes, Chief of Research and Development, and Celeste Morales, Senior Director of Research and Development, and both are from Companions and Animals for Reform and Equity. Thank you for being here today and sharing the results of your study.
Well, thank you all for having us. We're so grateful to be here and share about some of the data that we have collected on the topic of adoption barriers and discrimination. Noting that you can find the full report on our website. I think that link is going to get dropped here in the chat. Today, just for time's sake, we're going to share just a portion of the data. So we encourage y'all to check the report out if you want to see everything that we've gathered so far. Starting us off here with just some acknowledgements. This project would not have been possible without each and every member of our research team. Notably, we work with 16 local young people and proximate leaders to carry out recruitment for this project. So shout out to Jada Ford, Lexus Lee, and Valley Fraser Celine in particular, who supported with data analysis. Learning objectives for today are to describe the prevalence and impact of shelter rescue adoption discrimination in 4 U.S. cities, Atlanta, Philadelphia, Miami, and Minneapolis, as well as discussing solutions for increasing access to pet ownership for BIPOC families. So the overall takeaway for this study is this stat here. A 3% increase in BIPOC adoptions would result in 2 million pets finding homes. So all that to say that inclusion is still the solution. The shift that is needed is moving our inclusion work from intent to impact. If shelters and rescues are committed to ending pet homelessness and suffering, we must recognize that this is more than a supply and demand issue. Rather, it's an issue of BIPOC families being ignored or criminalized by the shelter and rescue industry, rather than being recognized as the critical assets that they are, for solving some of today's most pressing animal welfare priorities. The impact of BIPOC inclusion in pet adoptions is simple math. Just a 3% increase in BIPOC adoptions would result in 2 million pets finding homes. Our hope is that this data provides a foundation for us to move beyond documenting the disparities in access to pet ownership to prioritizing the solutions that will make health equity possible. I'm going to start with a little bit of background on what we already know about BIPOC pet acquisition and adoption discrimination in the U.S. All of the existing research so far on pet acquisition, so the American Pet Products Association, for example, it critically underrepresents or uses statistical manipulation to estimate the experiences of BIPOC and low-income families. But what we do know is that BIPOC families are less likely to go to shelters and rescues to get a pet. But when they do go to a shelter or rescue, they are more likely to be denied adoption than their white counterparts. For this project, we also wanted to do an additional exploration of the impacts of that adoption discrimination on BIPOC families. So this is one of the charts from one of the previous studies on this topic, the Racial Disparities in Animal Welfare Project, completed by the University of Tennessee Knoxville's Program for Pet Health Equity just last year in 2024. These are some charts that illustrate how pets are being removed from BIPOC or high social vulnerability index communities and adopted out to white lower social vulnerability index communities. So here on this image, the green communities indicate places where pets were moved to more white areas from BIPOC communities. This data here on the chart is from Los Angeles County, and the 2024 RDOL study had similar data collected from Charlotte, Detroit, and Dallas, showing similar trends of family separation and pet displacement. So these data indicate that this is not just a discretion or implicit bias issue that's driven by individual frontline staff, but a systemic replication of the racism and classism that is pervasive across the other areas of US society, like policing, healthcare, and housing. We wanted the study to explore how this issue of adoption discrimination impacts BIPOC families, including where they choose to get their pets. Now I'm going to pass off to Celeste to talk about the details of the study that we've been completing over the last year.
Thank you, Sloane. All right, so I'm going to share a little bit about the study goals, our participant recruitment methods, and then our data collection details as well. So we had 3 main goals with this study. The first was to understand pet acquisition and the human-animal bond within BIPOC families in the 4 major U.S. cities that Sloane mentioned, so Philly, Atlanta, Miami, and Minneapolis. The second goal was to document BIPOC experiences and outcomes with obtaining pets both inside and outside of the animal shelter and rescue industry. And then our third goal was to identify and amplify community-led solutions to pet acquisition in BIPOC communities. In terms of recruitment, in order to achieve those goals, we recruited individuals who self-identified as having experienced barriers or challenges to getting a pet, as opposed to other studies that have majority respondents with positive experiences with getting pets. And we focused on speaking with individuals who have had barriers and challenges to getting pets to really ensure that we are able to gather a much more comprehensive picture of what experiences with adoption discrimination looks like in each of those four focus communities. So this is a breakdown of how our survey participants were recruited. As you can see here, most of the participants were recruited from a family member, a friend, or a neighbor. And as Sloane mentioned, we hired and trained 16 local young people and proximate leaders across the focus communities to conduct our recruitment. And that was primarily done through word of mouth and flyers in public spaces. Our research assistants included individuals from We Love Philly, students from Red Lake Nation Tribal College, proximate leaders, and other BIPOC individuals who were interested in engaging in workforce development and gaining experience in community-based research. So this approach really underscores the importance of our model of partnering with local young people and proximate leaders to conduct recruitment for our studies. And this approach not only allows us to effectively reach some of the most, quote, hard to reach communities for research, but it is also really valuable workforce development. And we're really working to cultivate that next generation of social science researchers through our community-led approach to research. So we collected stories through both focus groups and surveys. The focus groups were done in person and virtually. We had a total of 26 participants. And then we used those findings from the focus groups to inform the development of the survey questions. And we had 311 survey participants. All right, so as we can see here from those 311 survey participants, those were distributed across the four focus communities, and the data were collected from BIPOC pet owners in mostly urban areas, but in Minnesota, there was quite a bit of tribal nation and rural representation. And we do have a very detailed breakout of the demographics in the report for anybody who's interested. I think the slides were shared in the chat there, but for the purposes of time, I'm just going to highlight a few of the key demographics. So first, as you can see here, we had an all BIPOC sample with 51% of participants identifying as Black, and the average age of the participants was 33 years old. Another notable highlight from the demographics here is that a majority of our sample at 61% is on the lower end of household income. So that means that their yearly household income was less than 30,000. And we highlight these two statistics here because in many other research efforts, particularly when working with online convenience samples, or even when recruiting directly through shelter or rescue organizations, low-income families and BIPOC participants tend to be the most underrepresented in those samples. So we are definitely proud of this very important representation that's been achieved through this study. All right, so moving on to share about the findings. First, we asked participants about their reasons for getting a pet, and the study participants demonstrated a very strong desire to use ethical and high-quality sources for getting their pets. Many shared about how they embody the rescue mentality that is often promoted by animal shelters and rescue organizations. We heard the term adopt, don't shop being discussed in our focus groups. So I'll read this quote here from a Philadelphia pet owner. They said, as to the reason why they decided to adopt, because I want to help the animals that can't find a home. I originally looked at the breeding option just so I can get exactly what I wanted, but my heart was just like, I want to save an animal. So, the primary reasons to get a pet that were shared by survey participants included companionship, emotional and mental support, and safety. And it's interesting to note here that these findings diverge from a previous study that found that companionship was listed as the primary reason for getting a pet, reported by middle and upper socioeconomic status pet owners, whereas more pragmatic reasons like security or adding income were indicated as being important reasons for lower socioeconomic status pet owners. Next, the survey participants responded to questions about their experiences with attempting to get a pet from the three primary sources for pets. So those were animal shelter and rescue organizations, professional or licensed breeders, and then friends, family members, or neighbors. So these next three slides here are presenting just some of the data that we collected on which sources for pets are utilized and what the outcomes were for any of those attempts to get a pet. So we grouped these outcomes by three categories of approved, which is shown here in black, denied, which is in pink, and then never applied, which is in green. So as I mentioned, there's a lot we could talk about here, but we're just going to highlight a few of the key points that is represented by these data. So notable here is the rate of individuals who were approved to get a pet from a friend, family member, or neighbor. That was at 60%. And this was the most common source for getting pets within our sample of BIPOC families. And we do want to be clear here that this section of the data does not solely include individuals obtaining puppies or kittens that are the results from litters of unaltered pets. Instead, often what we heard is that these were adult dogs and cats that needed to be rehomed within their community instead of surrendering to a shelter or rescue. So, in this way, many of those individuals who were obtaining pets from friends, family members, or neighbors are very valuable assets for keeping pets out of the shelter or rescue system to begin with. Okay, so here is the data on outcomes when going to a professional or licensed breeder for a pet. The overall prevalence of going to a professional or licensed breeder was quite low with this sample. It was just at 33% of our sample had attempted to get a pet from this source. From that, 12% had had their application approved by a breeder, and 7% of respondents indicated that their application was denied by a breeder. All right. And then this slide is showing the outcomes by shelter or rescue organization. So the two most common outcomes for the participants who attempted to get a pet from a shelter or rescue were either they never applied, which is indicated here in green at a total of 68%, or their application was denied, which is indicated here in pink at 19%. So noting in that in the survey, we broke out the never applied response options to include several subcategories. And those included they didn't have the pet I wanted, the pet was no longer available, the source was not accessible to me, and I never attempted this source. So through our study, we found that 19% of the BIPOC pet owners had been denied adoption from a shelter or rescue. And other studies, such as the UTK CARE RDOS study and CARE's Adopt a Pet survey, have measured adoption denials at a rate of about 10 to 14%. So we do believe that our sampling approach here of connecting with those who self-identified as experiencing barriers or challenges to getting pets has resulted in this more accurate number on the rate of denial at 19%. And the very important implication for this set of data is that each of these BIPOC families who were denied or who have not applied to get a pet from a shelter or rescue represent a very crucial potential asset to address the current shelter and rescue pet overpopulation issue. So to share a few insights into why BIPOC pet owners were choosing certain sources other than a shelter or rescue. This is a quote that embodies some of what participants shared about the perceived benefits of utilizing breeders as a source for pets. So this particular participant said the breeder didn't ask questions, They were just like, you want a dog? Here's a dog. And then, of course, they wanted payment. That's pretty much what it was. It was just a simple transaction, a smooth transaction. So, a previous study by Arluk and Rotkis from 2024 found that lower socioeconomic status individuals might be more likely to consider adopting a pet through an animal shelter or rescue organization, but they rarely end up getting a pet from this source due to a fear of rejection, concerns about the costs of adoptions, and discomfort with the paperwork associated and privacy concerns. And we did hear similar sentiments to this in our focus group. So the participants who did not adopt from animal shelters shared their perception of the shelter or rescue adoption process as time consuming. So some said that the process was too difficult, so they gave up. It was seen as costly, that the fees were high, and it was also seen as a judgmental process as well. So the focus group participants who got their pets from a professional or licensed breeder expressed a concern that if they had obtained a pet from a shelter or rescue, they thought that the pet might have had medical or behavioral challenges, and they would also have more limited information about the pet's background. So several of these participants also expressed a lack of trust in shelter or rescue organizations, particularly regarding whether shelters or rescues were avoiding disclosing information about the pet's background so that they can be adopted more quickly. So I will pass it on to Sloane now to talk about what we learned about BIPOC pet owners' experiences when getting pets from these sources.
All right. Moving along here on our data dump on y'all. Again, reminder, if you've got any questions as we go, drop them in the Q&A. We'll have lots of time at the end to answer any questions you have. So next up in this data set, we asked participants how they were treated during their interaction with each of the sources. So these are our data around the shelter or rescue organization experiences. The participants who had attempted to get a pet from a shelter rescue had the highest incidence of negative experiences at 71.2%, compared with the other two sources of the breeders, which was 54.9%, and friend, family, or neighbor at 22.6%. The negative experience here are demonstrated on the chart in pink, and the positive ones in yellow. The negative experiences range from being ghosted or provided with misinformation to disrespect, embarrassment, intimidation, and hostility. This is a quote from one of our Atlanta focus group participants that illustrates what this experience of disrespect from shelter rescues looked like. They said, one of the first things the shelter rescue adoption staff said was, it's very hard to get a dog from us. We don't just adopt to anybody. We'd rather keep them here forever. And I'm just like, wow, I just got here. Like, you don't know nothing about me, telling me how hard it is to get a dog. And so then they started to ask me things like, well, how are you going to afford this dog? And that's when we got into, oh, this is going to be my mom's dog and she's a doctor. And once they realized that she's a doctor, it was, well, then let me show you around. What dogs do you want to see? This chart here is talking about experiences with the breeders, the professional or licensed breeders. A slightly higher rate of being treated with kindness and respect here at 45%, and that's compared to the shelter rescue rate, again, which was just 28%. This is the data here around experiences with friend, family, or neighbors. We had 77% reported being treated with kindness and respect, with significantly lower rates of those negative experiences. So next we followed up to ask if they felt they were treated unfairly, and then if they said yes, what they felt was the basis for that unfair treatment. The top reasons for unfair treatment in shelters and rescues was my race, ethnicity, my household income or economic status, and my appearance. Noting that these are perceived reasons for mistreatment, and while shelter staff might say that the actual reason for denial was for something different, this perception really matters. Perception is where we measure things like trust, and those are some of the critical change mechanisms that can drive behavior change. So we think these data highlight how much work shelter rescues still have to do to close the gap between all the work some organizations have been doing to remove adoption barriers and whether or not those efforts are resulting in any shifts in BIPOC families' perceptions of shelter rescues as trustworthy sources of pets. So here we have the data around unfair treatment from professional or licensed breeders. We saw similar top reasons for unfair treatment from what we saw with shelters and rescues. And then these are the data around unfair treatment from friend, family member, or neighbors. Now, this is really interesting because we saw a shift in the top reasons for unfair treatment here being reasons like having surrendered a pet in the past, being a college student, having too many pets, which many have noted are more legitimate reasons to decline someone. So to share an example of what unfair treatment looked and felt like, this is a quote highlighting the unfair treatment on the basis of race, ethnicity at a shelter rescue. This Atlanta pet owner shared, every place that I tried to adopt from, they had this super lengthy process, this super intrusive process where they were asking really personal questions. The process did make me feel a little uncomfortable whenever it did come down to me having to share intimate details about myself, including sending a picture of me to them. I'm like, why? And I think that was a way to see if you're white, if you're black, like what you were giving. So yeah, I learned that appearance and also kind of like stereotypes. I didn't know that so many characteristic factors played into whether or not you will be able to adopt until I tried. And that was a long process. Like I want to say I spent months trying to adopt a dog. Here we have a quote that's highlighting what this unfair treatment based on neighborhood socioeconomic status looked like in the shelter rescue. There's another Atlanta pet owner sharing, I feel like a lot of times the outreach by animal shelter rescues is circular. They're preaching to the choir. They go to the people who have credit cards with no limits specifically for their dogs, and they talk to them about adopt, 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 but they don't come to our neighborhood with that same type of thing, you know? And so this is probably one of the most important sets of data from this study, in my opinion. This is the data asking about the impact of that unfair treatment. And so these data are particularly difficult to share, given that acknowledgement that the shelter rescue industry has been working on adoption discrimination for 10 plus years. The top impacts of unfair treatment at shelter rescues are, of course, choosing a different place to get a pet and being hesitant to get a pet from this source again. While smaller in relative percentage, it's important to highlight these data on the prevalence of the individuals who shared that they questioned whether they were a responsible or suitable pet owner and felt unworthy or undeserving of a pet. Just one person feeling this way is one too many. You know, adding a pet to the family should be a joyful and supportive experience that extends the opportunity for BIPOC families to gain access to the profound physical, social, and emotional benefits of the human bond, not one that reinforces this deficit view of BIPOC families as less than or irresponsible. This adoption discrimination is delaying Black and brown pet owners access to this powerful impact of the human bond. So these data are particularly heartbreaking, given that BIPOC families in the U.S. are subjected to stacked experiences of discrimination and systemic harm across most dimensions of society. For example, housing, education, economic opportunity, access to healthcare. These experiences of racism and discrimination have measurable impacts and long-term effects on BIPOC individuals' physical and emotional well-being. This data right here, this is my why, and it just further underscores how much work we still have to do as an industry around our inclusion practices. So this is our data around professional or licensed breeders. We saw similar impacts of unfair treatment by professional or licensed breeders as compared to shelter rescues, but again, there were fewer overall families that were being treated unfairly by the breeders. Here we have the data around friend, family member, or neighbor. Similar point here, an overall lower number of individuals who felt they were being treated unfairly. Let's see. All right, so as our final impact metric, we asked all of our survey participants about their level of trust in the three sources. And so you can see here, shelter or rescues came out as the least trusted at 46%. Professional or licensed breeders were next up at 51%. And the most trusted source for pets for BIPOC pet owners were friend, family members, or neighbors. And so now I will pass back off to Celeste.
Thank you, Sloane. All right, so I'm going to share a bit about post-acquisition experiences. So, some of the findings from the data that we collected about families' experiences after getting a pet. So, 38% of the BIPOC families did not have any challenges after getting their pets that they indicated in the survey, while the rest of the families did indicate a few different types of post-acquisition challenges. So the full breakdown is here on the slide, but the most common challenges were the cost of veterinary care, pet food, and grooming, and then a few different types of challenges related to behavior. So here we asked about the resources that were used post-acquisition by BIPOC families, and the top three resources that were used included low-cost or free vaccine clinics, low-cost or free spay-neuter clinics, and a pet food pantry. And in the survey, we saw that many pet owners did not utilize any resources after getting a pet. That was at about 35%, the teal bar there. But based on the survey alone, it wouldn't have been clear why those resources weren't being used. So this is why the focus groups are so important as a part of the research process as well, because we get to dig a little deeper and hear about those reasons why. So one of the focus group participants highlighted their potential hesitancy to utilize free or low-cost resources in their community due to the fear of being perceived as anything other than a responsible pet owner. So this participant said, I felt like I had to be a very proactive dog owner. I didn't have much grace to make mistakes, especially because I signed a contract with the shelter or rescue. That was like, if you do XYZ with the dog, you have to give it back. I do think that there was anxiety attached to that, and I don't think non-Black and brown pet owners typically have to go through this. It feels like they're just allowed to have their pets and fully enjoy their pets without having to worry about if they're being perceived as responsible pet owners. So, this hesitancy to utilize resources after acquiring a pet comes from a recognition of the bias against people who adopt and then use any sort of subsidized services immediately after. So, that's kind of attached to this idea of if you can't afford a pet, you shouldn't have one. When asked about any support or resources that they wish they had, one focus group participant shared that they were the only Black people in their puppy training class, and they shared this quote. So they said, I just wish I had more Black people when I was first raising my dog. I can't even talk about stuff or like ask for advice without fear of judgment. I just want to be able to go to a Black trainer and I want her to be able to play with dogs that I don't have to be afraid of her being ill perceived by other owners. So, one more quote here on post acquisition challenges. Another participant shared their views on representation and diversity of the animal welfare field. So, they said, and how that impacts BIPOC pet owners. So, they said, vet med is the least diverse profession in America. And that impacts everything. Vet med, animal welfare, dog training, pet sitting, like all of that just comes to be this very easy to feel judged. The animal community is just wild. It's not friendly. So, hearing about these experiences, we can understand that after experiencing those challenges of demonstrating their suitability as a responsible pet owner, it's only logical that BIPOC pet owners would be hesitant to reach back out to a shelter or a rescue to ask for support. So now I will pass it back off to Sloane to share about the solutions shared.
All right. So like all of our research, we want each of our projects to go beyond just documenting disparities and instead highlight the solutions that are needed to achieve equity. Here we share what the participants shared as their solutions for making the process of getting a pet a more positive and fair experience. The top three solutions included services, supplies, and information after adoption purchase, eliminating process barriers, and being more understanding of a person's financial situation. This aligns with some of the previously established solutions in the field, including HWA's Adopters Welcome, which if folks are not familiar with that, I highly encourage utilizing that resource, checking it out. It's been offered since 2012. In our stakeholder conversations about these data, we heard individuals from all areas of the pet industry speaking to the reality that we haven't made adequate progress on ending adoption discrimination and may even be seeing a resurgence of adoption barriers. These include things like home visits, which some of us who've been here for a bit thought that was a practice long gone, but apparently it's making a comeback. This backsliding may be due to the absence of a metric that captures what exactly we are working towards, which in our opinion should be increased access to pet ownership for all. To move to a space of making measurable progress towards equity, we need a measurable goal to work towards and hold ourselves accountable to. The goal put so clearly here by this participant is to eliminate the gatekeeping of pet ownership by making pet ownership accessible. They said, we're going to identify all these issues and come up with like actual solutions versus just like gatekeeping dogs for a certain group of people. Let's make pet ownership accessible. So again, we're proposing that metric is a 3% increase in BIPOC adoptions. To address shelter capacity challenges, we need to close the gap between the barriers that shelters believe they have eliminated and the public perception of shelter rescues as individuals who are gatekeeping pet ownership. The best way to close that gap is with real impact, with pets in homes, not just marketing. BIPOC pet owners represent one of the most promising opportunities for reaching new potential pet adopters and addressing shelter rescue capacity challenges in the US. We estimate that just a 3% increase in BIPOC adoptions from shelter rescue organizations across the US would result in an additional 2 million pets finding help. 3% is both an attainable and an impactful goal. So how do we get there? There's a lot of programs out there designed to walk orgs through eliminating adoption of barriers like Adopters Welcome. CARE also has certificates, our racial equity, diversity, inclusion, or READY courses that include several programmatic solutions to advance both inclusion and equity. If you'd like to hear directly from organizations that have taken the course here at CARE, the READY courses, and seen that impact, please don't hesitate to reach out. We would love to connect you. And with that, we will close out the presentation portion, and we've got plenty of time for Q&A.
Great, thank you. We have one in the Q&A box. Alicia, it's not necessarily a question, but more of a conversation opener. I wonder how much of a difference it would make if shelters did more straight from original home to adopter home type adoptions. I've heard about a shelter in England that works with families to advertise their dog, but the dog never has to enter the shelter, so the family could work directly with the adopter. Thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I would defer to the shelter operations professionals on the feasibility and kind of what those models look like in practice, but based on the data, the friend and family sources are most trusted. And so if we can reallocate our resources, for lack of a better way to put it, from in-house shelter adoptions to in-community, I think that's backed by the data.
Okay, and I saw a question in the chat from Lawrence. Was there any question in the survey that separated or differentiated between sourcing and engagement with a shelter versus a rescue? Anecdotally, rescues and shelters have some differences in adoption approval criteria, which of course is also nested in local and geographic effects.
Yeah, so we developed the survey questions based off of the focus groups, and what became super clear in the focus groups is that the public doesn't differentiate between a shelter organization and a rescue organization, even though those of us in the industry on the shelter and rescue side, we know there are some differences between how they're run and the structures and the best practices and what have you. So yeah, we approach this from the perspective of how does the community member understand this ecosystem and the system of acquiring pets. And so we did not differentiate shelter rescue in the data set, but we acknowledge that in terms of y'all from a practitioner perspective would have been useful.
Lynn says, do you have data on specific cases where this study has made a positive impact?
I feel like we're leaning to you all, looking to you all to start collecting that data. And we'd love to partner with you on that. In terms of next steps for the research, that's exactly where we're headed, is to do deep dives with organizations to understand once they've implemented the adoption barriers, what are the measurable impacts of that. So yeah, reach out if you'd like to be a part of producing that positive impact data. We are here.
Awesome. Another one, I love this presentation and the data you shared. I'm just wondering if the data was analyzed for statistical significance, given what seems like a lowish sample size. Also, any plans to continue the research?
Yeah, at this time we just presented to you all the descriptive statistics and didn't do additional analyses. Again, if folks are interested in partnering with us to do additional analyses, we love that kind of stuff. So fair game. In terms of next steps for the research, I mentioned we're hoping to partner with communities, individual communities who want to do a deep dive into this and produce those measurable impacts around BIPOC adoptions. We are also hoping to collect this data set in Canada. So stay tuned for that, hopefully coming next year.
Awesome. Elizabeth is asking, can you do a study that matches applications to control for all variables except race? That would help tease out where the discrimination is coming from. Would it be solely race versus income versus type of housing?
Yeah, again, we would love all research ideas, all partnerships that are interested in taking on this challenge with us. So yeah, again, we just kind of started at the top level of understanding what the landscape looks like, and now this is the time where we get to do deep dives into any of the topics and do the additional analyses that would help shore this up further.
Alicia says, one major issue I see is that management in shelters is not diverse at all. The floor staff is often diverse, but the decision makers are not, and I volunteer in a city that is at least half Black. I would love to see more people that look like the people in the community in leadership roles. All
Oh,
right.
sorry. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, yes, for sure. And I think that also came up in the solution slide. It was a little bit lower, but there was definitely recognition and prioritization, if you will, from the community members that diversity of staff, training around inclusive practices and what have you, all that really matters.
Thank you. One more. I work for an open admissions shelter that has an open adoption policy for exactly these reasons. But how can we better work with local rescues that have restrictive adoption policies?
Yeah, this is where kind of outside of my wheelhouse, right? Like I'm a researcher, like scholar activist side of things. But yeah, so I defer maybe Kelly or Sheila or others folks who have something to say about that.
It's difficult. Oh, Sheila, go ahead.
All right, I can chime in here, but certainly don't have answers. This is something that I have worked on some in my career in terms of working with local organizations to try to encourage them to maybe see things in a different light. And it's really, really tough, right? Because oftentimes people have one experience and that one negative experience with someone that looks a certain way. And then they therefore make blanket statements regarding this is what we do. And changing minds is very, very, very difficult because people have to want to change and want to do things differently. And I am definitely not an expert in psychology and figuring out how to get people to want to change. My experiences with those organizations has been working to make change and bringing them in and building community so that we can start talking about things and having friendly conversations. And also, what I tend to do, which may or may not be the right thing, but is accept them for who they are because they are finding homes for animals. They're not doing it in the way I want, and they're doing things differently than I or my organization would certainly do. But they are providing a service to the community. But it's tough.
Yeah, and if you think they need to hear it from somebody other than you, encourage them to do things like connect with the HWA staff on Adopters Welcome or take a Ready course. I think those are two really accessible, low-cost options that you can introduce to your ecosystem outside of your shelter of folks doing acquisition practices. And so that's another maybe thing in the toolkit to throw out there.
Absolutely. Can you share the recommended adoption application for small rescues for cats and kittens only? Or do you have one?
So that's not something that I have access or knowledge about. Again, I would recommend the HWA Adopters Welcome team and then defer to Maddie's if there's other resources y'all would prioritize.
Thank you. Any other questions? Thank you all so much for being here. This has been really, really informative, and I think that we need to do better. All right. Thank you so much, Sloane and Celeste. And thanks to all of you who have been watching today's webcast. Sloane and Celeste will be available on Maddie's Pet Forum to continue this discussion and answer your questions. Thank you all, and we will see you next time.